Hello everybody, you're watching Robot Relics and I have a special treat for all of you today. We're doing a limited set review of Dominaria United, specifically the rares and mythics of the set. Now, I already have, at this point, all of the commons and uncommons already rated. You'll be able to find a link to the playlist in the description below, and you can also find it by going directly to my channel. I use a 1 to 10 rating scale for the cards, and we're going to outline that real quick. There should also be a time code inside the description that will reach where the actual review starts if you've already seen me go through this before. So there's 5 main categories that I kind of group things into when I rate them. 1 and 2 are the worst cards in Limited. They're either cards that belong in the sideboard, things that just aren't supported archetypes, or actual design mistakes. 3s, 4s, and 5s are your most common ratings for commons and uncommons. Worse than filler, and good filler, good playable cards and stuff like that. They vary pretty widely, and there's some wiggle room in between. But for the most part, you can kind of tell where a card belongs pretty easy once you play it. 6 and 7, these are some of the better cards in Limited. They're either great high-tier playables that signal a color combo is open, or they're removal spells that are efficient, or they're actual first-pick archetype-defining cards that just blow other things out of the water in terms of power level. 8 and 9 are god tiers, or like rare bombs, things that just are so far and away above any common or uncommon that they don't even belong in the same relative tier. And then 10 is stuff that is up for debate as the better and best cards of the set, like top 3, top 4 level cards. There aren't going to be almost any of these, and there are definitely none at common and uncommon. I'm expecting that there will be maybe 1 or 2 of them per set. Without any further ado, let's get right into it, and we're going to be doing the multicolor mythics, followed by rares, then colorless mythics and rares, and then backwards down to white, all inside of this video, and at the end we'll go over lands and some general thoughts. So our first card is Ajani Sleeper Agent, which is a 1 green Phyrexian hybrid, green-white, and white for a Planeswalker with 4 loyalty. You can pay that middle symbol of mana with 2 life, green or white. If you pay life, it enters with 2 fewer counters. So you can play it for 3, but it only comes in with 2 loyalty counters, which is a little rough. It's still fine, and I think there's going to be times when you'll be happy to play it in Limited for that kind of cost. But the difference between 1 extra turn and an extra 2 loyalty is pretty big. You do want loyalty on your planeswalkers to be high in Limited, because if your opponent just has like any removal spell, kills your creature, and then kills your planeswalker, that's really bad for you, and planeswalkers are generally pretty strong. There is one problem with this one. The +1, -3, and -6 are all a little bit rough. So +1, reveal the top card of your library. If it's a creature or planeswalker, put it into your hand, otherwise you may put it on the bottom of your library. You're only looking at the top 1. You do have a lot of creatures in your average Limited deck, but even if it's like 16, which is a pretty high creature count, somewhere between 16 and 20, like really high, that's still only going to be half your deck max, and this is going to whiff pretty often. The -3 requires you to have creatures. It doesn't actually protect the Ajani at all. You can distribute 3 1/1 counters among up to 3 target creatures. They gain vigilance until end of turn. This is good if you already have a board state, but I don't like planeswalkers that I already have to have a board state in order to use. And another problem is that in the green-white archetype specifically, you're incentivized to have a lot of creature tokens, specifically 1/1s, and making your 1/1s into 2/2s with vigilance until end of turn is it's not always going to let you get in. And then the -6 is you get an emblem with, whenever you cast a creature or planeswalker spell, target opponent gets 2 poison counters. That actually takes a very long time to kill your opponent. That's 5 additional creatures after you actually ultimate this. So you can play this on turn 4 to give it the max loyalty, plus it up to 5. Turn 5, you could plus it up to 6. Turn 7, you can get your ultimate off if there's no interaction with the planeswalker, but then you have to get 5 additional casts on creatures in order to get there. And 5 isn't too many, but it is a lot, and you have to remember, you're not working on the same game plan as regular damage. This is completely different. If they get 10 poison counters, they lose the game, but they can be at 9 poison counters and 20 life, and be perfectly healthy unless you cast the last creature somehow. I mean, I guess they wouldn't be at 9 under any circumstances, but you know what I mean. Overall, I think Ajani is still a fine card, and I think it is above rate. I think it deserves a 5. I don't think it really approaches 6 territory, mostly because it doesn't have a way to protect itself, and the best planeswalkers always give you some kind of way to protect themselves. Joyra the Unifier is our next card, and it is 1 of each color for 5 mana total for a 5/5. With legendary creatures you control, get +X/+X, where X is the number of legendary creatures you control. And whenever you cast a legendary spell from your hand, exile cards from the top of your library until you exile a legendary non-land card with lesser mana value. You may cast that card without paying its mana cost. So, this only fits in one archetype. If you're in that archetype and you can cast it, and you have other legends, it's good. Otherwise, it's a basically uncastable vanilla 5/5 in a lot of situations. I think this card is just not a supported archetype. I mean, let's call it what it is. This is a 5-color mythic that cares about legendary creatures, which there's a good number of in the set, but like, I don't think this does enough. This is a 2. Next up is Rith, Liberated Primeval, which is 2, a red, a green, and a white, 5 mana for a 5/5 with flying and ward 2. And other dragons you control have ward 2. At the beginning of your end step, if a creature or planeswalker an opponent controlled was dealt damage, excess damage this turn, create a 4/4 red dragon creature token with flying. So this is really good. So the way that you get this to work is you play it because it's a 5 mana 5/5 flyer with ward 2. And if you can find some kind of way to deal any creature excess damage before you play this, like attack with your big creature and it gets jump blocked or something, you also get a 4/4 for your trouble. And ward 2 is a good way to make sure that it at least survives until their turn when they untap all their mana. So it's not hard to get a lot of value out of this. I would say that this is easily a 7. I think this is far and away better than a lot of cards, and I think the fact that it is at least in green makes it easier to cast. I would say that this is starting to approach 8 territory, but you do have to do some work to get that advantage. This is definitely a card I would first pick in most packs, though. Shawna, Purifying Blade. Oh, Shawna was Sisei's Legacy and uncommon last time we were in Dominaria. Interesting, she's growing up. A green, white, and blue for a 3/3 with lifelink, and at the beginning of your end step, you may pay X. If you do, draw X cards. X can't be greater than the amount of life you gained this turn. So, this is asking you to gain life. I've already looked into the commons and uncommons. There are a good number of ways to incidentally gain life, so you don't have to bash in with this, but you should be prepared for the fact that primarily your way to gain the card advantage with this card is going to be beating in with it. It is a 3/3 for 3 with lifelink. Those are good cards, but it's very difficult to cast. You'll know if you can support this, if you can cast it, and if you have anything else inside your deck that works with it. If you do, good. It's going to go up some amount. But otherwise, I think this is a 4.5. I just think the mana cost is extremely restrictive for what is going to be a very difficult to cast 3/3 with lifelink that has marginal benefit if it manages to survive a combat, and you don't have any other ways to make it work. Solkanar the Tainted is 2, a blue, a black, and a red for a 5/5. I'm seeing a pattern with the 5/5s for 5 here. At the beginning of your end step, choose one that hasn't been chosen. Draw a card. Each opponent loses 2 and you gain 2. Solkanar deals 3 damage to up to 1 other target creature or planeswalker, and then exile it and return it to the battlefield under an opponent's control. So there's some pretty interesting stuff you can do with this. There's at least 1 or 2 cards, I think, that can return this to your hand. Also, since you're playing black, you can just sacrifice it for a benefit. This is also something that triggers on your end step, not your upkeep. So it's very important to remember that you do get the benefit right away as long as it lives until your end step. And a lot of times that's just going to be either deal 3 damage to something or draw a card. And those are both really, really good effects. I think this is a 7. I don't think this is an unbeatable card, but it's definitely a 2-for-1. It's just difficult to cast. I think the fact that it's also a 5/5 for 5 passes the vanilla test extremely well, and doesn't have to do much of anything except survive till the end of your turn in order to get you that benefit and immediately get its worth, makes it a 7. Soul of Windgrace is next. That is 1, a black, a red, and a green for a 5/4 cat avatar. And whenever it enters the battlefield or attacks, you may put a land card from a graveyard onto the battlefield tapped under your control. Interesting. You can also pay a green mana, discard a land card to gain 3 life, pay a black and, 1 and a red to discard a land card and draw a card, and then pay 2 and a black and discard a land card to give it indestructible until end of turn, and tap it. This is a pretty powerful card. The fact that it's a 4 mana 5/4 that also has like utility built into it automatically means that it's going to be like at least a 6. I think this is definitely more powerful than your average card. The fact that it can get indestructible until end of turn means it's going to be pretty difficult to like just cleanly deal with this thing, unless you have some combination of combat and an instant inside your hand to kill it once they try to pay 3 to discard a land card and give it indestructible. And the fact that you can then attack with it and get back the land card that you discarded and just put it straight onto the battlefield means you're not really missing out on too much of that utility from your actual land drops. Overall, I would give this card a 7 as well. Then we have Zur, Eternal Schemer, which is a white, blue, and black for a 1/4 flyer with enchantment creatures you control have Death Touch, Lifelink, and Hexproof. And you can pay 1 and a white to make a non-aura enchantment you control become a creature in addition to its other types, and a bunch of stuff. I'll play it straight with you. This is an interesting card. It looks really cool. It's a little goblin dude right there. I know he's a human wizard, but he looks like a little monster to me. This is a 2. It's not a supported archetype. This is a little bitty constructed seed that is at the mythic level, so you won't have to deal with it too often in draft because it is literally a miss. And if I'm going to be phantom drafting this set at all, I'm going to look at this card and go, well, that's just a wasted rare slot. We're going to go to the rare slot now and take a look at what we have. A lot of legends, I would imagine. Okay. First up is Astor, Bearer of Blades. 2, a red, and a white for a 4/4 with, when it enters the battlefield, look at the top 7 cards of your library. You may reveal an equipment or vehicle card from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom in a random order. Equipment you control have equip 1, vehicles have crew 1. This is an unsupported archetype. There are not that many vehicles, and there are not that many equipment. And the equipment that are in the set have equip 2. This is not a big enough bonus for you to really want to gravitate towards building around the strategy. What this does have going for it is that if you are playing an equipment, or I don't even know if there is a vehicle in this set right now, There's a couple at rare, but none at common and uncommon. If you manage to get one of those common equipments, this does look at 7 cards. That's a lot of them. You have a pretty decent chance of finding it. Definitely not 100%, but better than 0, and if you get the equipment, this card shoots up pretty massively. So, passes a vanilla test. I would say I would take this card as a 5 if you have the equipment in your deck. If you don't have equipment, this is just a 4.3 maybe, because it's just a 4/4 for 4 that will naturally accrue some amount of hate. Specifically because it's a legend and it's a rare, people are going to want to kill it. The worst players anyway. The higher up in skill level you get, the less people will tend to care about a card like this, especially if they're familiar with the set, but I think it's a 4.3 or so. Definitely not a 5 at all. Urtai Resurrected is next. 2, a blue and a black for a 3/2 with flash, and when it enters the battlefield you can choose up to 1. Destroy another target creature or planeswalker, its controller draws a card, or counter target spell, activated ability, or triggered ability, its controller draws a card. So, the fact that they do draw a card off of you using the ability is definitely not a big downside. There's definitely still ways to break the parity here. One of those ways is to have double blocks work out poorly for your opponent. Another way is to counter combat tricks. They get the card back, but they are going to lose their creature at the end of the exchange, which means while they are technically not down a card from the thing that you blew up or countered, they are down the creature that got blown out as a response. So Urtai Resurrected, I think, is really, really easy to cast and pretty easy to make work, and for that reason I'm going to give it a 7. It's a good first pickable card. It definitely blows out most commons and uncommons. It's definitely not unbeatable, but it's a pretty easy 2-for-1 in colors that have access to a lot of weird, tricky shenanigans. And when you cast this card, people are not going to be expecting it. Ivy Gleeful Spell Thief is next. It's a green and a blue for a 2/1 with flying, and whenever a player casts a spell that only targets a single creature other than Ivy, you may copy that spell. The copy targets Ivy. That is a very, very weird ability. So, it does have some rules text that lets you know that it is, in fact, also going to affect auras. The problem is there are not that many auras you want to be casting, at least in common and uncommon. I'm kind of leaving out all the rares and stuff because you're definitely not going to be able to rely on them. Like with Astor, there are going to be some vehicles and equipment at rare. I am not considering those when I'm looking at Astor's rating. Like, I'm just not. 90% of the time your deck is going to consist of almost nothing but commons and uncommons, with maybe somewhere between 1 and 4 rares. And you'll be lucky if they work together in the way that you want them to. So for Ivy, we're looking at combat tricks. And green and blue do have some interesting stuff going on. I just don't know if this is good enough to really, be considered that good. One problem is that, the reward is not worth the risk, and the risk is playing more combat tricks. Green and blue, they're not really a color that need combat tricks that much, so I would say that this is probably a 5. I'd say it's above rate in the fact that it's a 2/1 flyer for 2 mana with some marginal upside, but I don't really think it's incredible. Notably, the only thing I think that brings it up to 5 instead of 4 is the fact that if your opponent casts a pump spell or some kind of enchantment, you also get it on Ivy if you want it. And that's really good. But it's still marginal, because combat tricks are not free. Also, if your opponent casts a removal spell, you can accidentally say, yes, I would like that to copy and target Ivy. So don't do that. So Ivy is going to get a 5. Joyra, Ageless Innovator, is a blue and a red for a 2/3 with tap, put 2 Ingenuity counters on Joyra. Then you may put an artifact card with mana value X or less from your hand onto the battlefield, where X is the number of Ingenuity counters on Joyra. This is a 5. Well, no, I guess. So it beats the vanilla test, but it's an unsupported archetype. So really, you're just putting this in your deck because it is a 2 mana 2/3. That's slightly difficult to cast, and that is above rate. I don't think it's 4 because I don't think you'd play a 2/3 for 3. Well, I think you would play a 2/3 for 3 above a lot of 23rd cards. It's definitely better than like a vanilla 2/2 or something. And I guess there is a technical possibility that you might have something that works with this at the uncommon slot. Maybe you can throw an equipment and play with it and be kind of happy. But I don't think this is a very good card. I think this is a 5 at the best of times, and more likely to be a 4 if you're in a focused blue-red deck that's trying to beat down. But it's pretty close to a 2, since it's definitely an unsupported archetype. It's a constructed seed if I've ever seen one. King Darien, oh god, what the hell is that? I don't remember, to be honest, how to read Roman numerals, so I'm not going to attempt to. 1 a green and a white for a 2/3 with other creatures you control get +1/+1. For 3 a green and a white, you can put a 1/1 counter on it and get a 1/1 white soldier creature token. And then you can sacrifice it to get tokens you control, hexproof and indestructible until end of turn. And I gotta say, this is a pretty good payoff for just playing the green-white deck. There are a lot of creatures and spells that pay you off massively, giving you a lot of bodies. And having this card, which is only 3 mana, be a relatively sizable body on its own, not too bad, and just pump the rest of your team, and have an insane activated ability, well no, 2 insane activated abilities, just really puts this card way above par. And if you ever draw it in the mid-game, that second ability to make a 1/1 white soldier creature token and put a 1/1 counter on it is really big game. Like, it becomes the King Darien subgame at that point, and that is a pretty strong subgame. Your opponent has to deal with this, or else, especially in the green-white deck, it's going to get out of control. I think this is going to be our first 8, because it slots right into any green-white deck, and you don't need anything else to make it good. It might even be close to a 9, but it is not unbeatable, and it does not have any inherent protection, so I think it only sits at 8. Definitely a card I'd first pick over any of the other cards I've seen so far, especially since it's only in 2 colors. Next up we have Maria, Scholar of Antiquity, which is 1 a red and a green for a 3/3 with tap an untapped non-token artifact you control, add green mana, and tap 2 untapped non-token artifacts you control. Exile the top card of your library you may play this turn. This is just an unsupported archetype. If you're playing specifically green-red, this is just a legend that is a 3/3 for 3. That's a 2 in my book. A replacement level card at the best of times. Highest grade I can give it is a 4, but as far as rares go, you're going to be pretty disappointed to see this one. Nemata, Primeval Warden, is 2 a black and a green for a 3/4 with reach. Already I like that body, it's not bad at all. I would give a card like that a 4, so we'll see if the abilities are good. If a creature an opponent controls would die, exile it instead. When you do, create a 1/1 green sapperling creature token. That's already incredible, and there are 2 other abilities on the card. I think that brings the card up to a 6. We'll see what the other abilities do. You could pay a green, sacrifice a sapperling, and this card gets +2/+2 until end of turn. And you could pay 1 and a black, sacrifice 2 sapperlings, and draw a card. So, this card is a 7. It's gonna sit and play, and if your opponent does not remove it, Every single trade they make is bad for them. Every removal spell that you draw is bad for them. You can make this thing bigger to work with your green fight spells, and you can sacrifice 2 saplings in order to draw a card, and that is pretty powerful. So there's a lot of versatility here, a solid amount of power, and it's not very difficult to cast. All it asks is that your opponent's creatures die, and the exile clause is not nothing. Definitely not nothing. There's a lot of ways to get creatures back from your graveyard in this set, both in green and black especially, so I think that exile clause is definitely solid. With that in mind, this is going to be a 7. I don't think it reaches up into 8 territory. It's going to be a little bit difficult to get a perfect 2 for 1 out of this. You do need like a turn or 2 to try and make that happen, but it's definitely good. Next is Ratadrobik of Urborg, which is a 2 white black 3/3 for a zombie wizard with vigilance and ward 2 that gives other zombies you control vigilance, and whenever another legendary creature you control dies, create a token that's a copy of it except it's not legendary, and it's a 2/2 black zombie in addition to its other colors and types. So this is asking for you to have a lot of other legendary creatures, and for you to play all of them first, and then have them die, and then they come back as 2/2s. That's a lot to ask. I think if you have like 2 or 3 legends inside your deck that you can play, and then you get this, it can be good, and it can be like a 6 once that happens if all of it comes together. But more often than not, this is going to be a 4 mana 3/3 with vigilance and ward 2. There aren't that many zombies at common and uncommon, and giving them vigilance is okay, but it's not that good. Like, this is a 5. It's above rate, but not by much. Rivaz of the Claw is 1, a black and a red, for a 3/3 with menace. Already, those are pretty good stats. I would definitely give that somewhere around a 4.5. It's definitely aggressively costed. Usually for that 3 mana, we've seen 2 3s with menace. That extra power definitely gives it a big boost. You can tap it to add 2 mana in any combination of colors. Spend it only to cast dragon creature spells. Once during each of your turns, you may cast a dragon creature spell from your graveyard, and whenever you cast a dragon creature spell from your graveyard, it gains, when this creature dies, exile it. This is an unsupported archetype, but the card is above par. If you are in the red-black aggressive deck, and you do want a menace creature that's going to beat your opponent down for a relatively low cost, you can do worse than this. So for that reason, it's above replacement level, but not by much. I would say it is a low 5. Then we have Sten, Paranoid Partisan, which is a white and a blue for a 2/2, and when it enters the battlefield, choose a card type other than creature or land. Spells you cast of the chosen type cost 1 less to cast. You'll know exactly what kind of cards you're going to be casting the most, either based on what's in your hand or what's in your deck. And then it also has a second ability. 1, a white and a blue, exile it and return it to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. So, if you have the mana lying around, this is a great blocker because you can block something and then exile this and return it. Your creature doesn't die, the creature that you blocked doesn't deal any damage. And then the cost reduction is a nice little bonus. You could probably get some value out of that, which you'll need if you're ever going to be exiling Sten and returning it. I think if you're in blue-white and you're aggressive, this is going to be kind of bad. Unless you have like a good number of tempo cards, like the bounce cards, stuff like that. And then it's good. In that case, I would give it a 6. And if you are the controlling deck, I think it also would end up being close to a 6. I think the main things that I like about it are the fact that it is just going to pass the vanilla test. The exile ability is good for both keeping it alive and keeping you alive if you're on the back foot. And the spell cost reduction is just enough. I think this just squeaks out being a 6. Yeah, I like that. Showcase, we're not going through the showcases. And the rest is, yeah, textured and then the commander cards. So with that, we're going to move to Coverless. Alright, Karn Silex is a 3-mana artifact that enters the battlefield tapped. Players can't pay life to cast spells or to activate abilities that aren't mana abilities. And you can pay X, tap it, and exile it to destroy each non-land permanent with mana value X or less, and activate it only as a sorcery. So, this is a very interesting card, and definitely has the capability to make your opponent stay miserable. You pay 3 for it, then it just kind of sits around, and if at any point your opponent commits too hard on the ground with some low drops, you can just blow them out of the water with this. Of course, the turn that you play this, it comes in tap, so you can't do it all at once. It's not going to be a big surprise, and then your opponent's probably just going to flunge everything at you. But this does create some problems for your opponent, because if they flunge everything, and you have any good blocks lined up at all, you can just block well, and then their board is decimated and you keep your Karn Silex. This is a catch-up mechanic that you don't have to pull the trigger on if you don't want to. And I like that. You can also use it just to deal with problematic permanents if your opponent is just way further ahead than you are. And it also just destroys any non-land permanent. It's not just creatures, it's enchantments, artifacts, planeswalkers, everything. So I think that this card is an 8 in the right circumstances, but there's going to be times where it plays like a 7. Overall, I think you're definitely going to find places to get like 2 for 1s and sometimes 3 or more for 1s, and that definitely puts it way above almost every common and uncommon for sure. But it doesn't belong in just any deck, and there are going to be times when if you use it, you're going to be killing some of your own stuff, and you have to be willing to do that when you put it in your deck. So Karn Living Legacy is next. I have a video on this card already. I think it's really bad. For one, it's an unsupported archetype. There are almost no artifacts in this set worth casting, and we're looking at all the other ones right now. We already looked at the commons and uncommons the other day, and most of those kind of suck. So we'll see what this thing's abilities are, and I'll give you my final thoughts. 4 mana for a Planeswalker with 4 loyalty, +1, create a tapped Power Stone token. That is an artifact with tap, add colorless mana. It can't be spent to cast a non-artifact spell. It can be used to activate abilities and do other things like that, but it cannot cast any spells that are not artifacts. I don't know why it makes these tokens tapped. I don't think it would have been too powerful if the tokens were untapped. I don't think it would have been too powerful if the tokens made any color of mana, but I didn't make the card. The +1 sucks. -1, pay any amount of mana, look at that many cards from the top of your library, put 1 into your hand and the rest on the bottom in any order, or random order. This is a very costly ability, and it's Karn's best ability. I guess if you have a really, really, really good aggressive deck, or an optimal control deck, and you have literally nothing but time on your hands, and you cast this on like turn 8 or something, it'll be okay. The +1 feeds into the -1 because the tapped Power Stone tokens you can use to pay the mana, but overall it's an extremely slow draw engine, and we already looked at a better card that only costs 1 extra mana at the uncommon slot that I'm much more happy to play than this. And then the -7 ability is, you get an emblem with tap an untapped artifact you control. This emblem deals 1 damage to any target. The emblem is good, but this has to sit around for quite a while before you get there, and in the meantime your opponent gets to play spells and attack with creatures. I think Karn Living Legacy is at the best of times a 4 out of 10. It is a replacement level card. You have to do a whole lot of work just to get a card out of it, and you're not even guaranteed to do that. If you plus this thing, there's a good chance your opponent just ignores it. Like, if you're playing against an aggressive deck and you play this, this doesn't protect you in any way. And if you spend time paying mana into this to draw cards when your opponent's actually developing their board, you're going to lose the game. This is a bad card and you probably shouldn't play it, but if you do, at least you have the knowledge of what to do with it. Timeless Lotus is next. It is 5 mana for a legendary artifact that enters the battlefield tapped, and you can tap it to add 1 of each color of mana. Well, we've come a long way since Gilded Lotus, haven't we? Gilded Lotus was actually a rare in the last Dominaria set, and I played it in a couple of decks because it helped me with some pretty ambitious splashes. But I don't know if Timeless Lotus is worth. There's not really a whole lot of things that pay you off for going from 5 mana all the way up to 10. But I guess if you're in the domain deck and you have some pretty spicy stuff you want to do, you can do worse than Timeless Lotus. It just doesn't turn your domain on because this doesn't have all of the basic land types. So be aware of that when you put it inside your deck, if you ever do. And then finally we have Weatherlight Completed, which is a 2 mana artifact. A vehicle with no crew cost. Interesting. So, if you can turn it on, which I guess the card denotes how, it is a 5/5. As long as it has 4 or more Phresis counters on it, it's a Phyrexian creature in addition to its other types. It also has flying, of course. Whenever a creature you control dies, put a Phresis counter on it, then draw a card if it has 7 or more. If it doesn't, scry 1. So, the best chance you have of making this work is playing a black-red deck. There's a lot of disposable creatures there, but I guess in green-white you can also get there because of all the creature tokens. If you can ever turn it on, a 5/5 flyer that you only pay 2 mana and some time for is pretty good. But if you're playing a creature-light deck, or you don't have a way to like consistently make sure that a bunch of creatures die that you control, this is going to be a miserable card. It's just going to be a 2 mana enchantment that lets you scry 1 when one of your creatures dies, and that is not that good. You'll know if you want this in your deck. If you put it in your deck and you can turn it on a good amount of the time, this is going to play like a 7. But if you don't, it's going to play like a 3. It's going to be really, really, really bad, below replacement level. So keep that in mind. Now we've gone through the mythics, let's look at the rare colorless cards now. Oh, is that's not it, is it? Wow, I guess that's the only artifact rare there is. It's kind of goofy, I was expecting more. Golden Argosi is a 4 mana vehicle. That's a 3/6 with crew 1. What? Interesting. Crew 1 on a 3/6 is pretty powerful. That definitely gives you a way to crew creatures that otherwise wouldn't be doing, do something with creatures that otherwise wouldn't be doing anything. Let's see what it actually does though. Whenever it attacks, exile each creature that crewed it this turn. Return them to the battlefield tapped under their control, owner's control, at the beginning of the next end step. So, there aren't that many enter the battlefield abilities. This feels kind of like a constructed thing, but is it good just on its own merits? I don't think so. I think this is a 4. Unless you have very specific things you're trying to do with it, specific enter the battlefield effects, I don't think this is anything but a 4. If you do have those things, good, but I don't remember that many things in the common and uncommon slots that really give you like a big boost from this card. So it's just a 4 mana 3/6 that requires an additional creature just to exist. And that's not good enough these days. Green is next. We're going to start with the Mythics and work our way down. Silverback Elder is 2 green, 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 or a 5/7 with whenever you cast a creature spell, choose one of the following. Destroy target artifact or enchantment. Look at the top 5 of your library. You may put a land card from among them onto the battlefield tapped, put the rest on the bottom in a random order, or you gain 4 life. This is a really powerful card. It's a little difficult to cast with the triple green, but it pays you off massively. It's a 5 mana 5/7 that gives you a bonus when you cast the most common creature, the most common card type in limited. This is an 8. Like, it's not very difficult to get some added bonus out of this. It doesn't have any protection on it, but it's just so far above par in every single metric that it's hard to give it anything but an 8. First pick this card if you see it, find a way to play it, you're going to be happy. Even if all you do is cast a spell and gain 4 life, you've gotten value out of it. And if you're at a stable life total at all, you're just going to start looking at the top 5 and putting a land into play, because that takes a land out of your deck, and that's actually quite valuable. And since you're using Silverback Elder in general, you're going to be churning through... What was I going towards? You're going to be churning through your deck in 1 or 2 different ways. So green-red has some good ways to get card advantage out of card draw spells, and getting extra lands in play helps you just develop out your board state. In green-black, you have a lot of ways to get back creatures, and that can help you to both emphasize your board state and build out your advantage that way. And then in green-blue, you have both a good common and uncommon that are both very mana-hungry, and God forbid you ever get 2 of these. You're just going to run out of lands inside your deck. The World Spell is next, and that is a 5 green green for a Enchantment Saga with read ahead, which means you can start at Chapter 2 or Chapter 3 if you desire, but you're going to skip the other chapters if you go that far. Chapter 1 and 2 are the same. Look at the top 7 cards of your library. You may reveal a non-saga permanent card from among them and put it into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom in a random order. And then, Chapter 3, put up to 2 non-saga permanent cards from your hand onto the battlefield. This is a bit complicated. So it's 7 mana, and you don't actually get anything up front except a draw card. That's very, very costly. You can't really do stuff like that in limited most of the time, especially on a card this expensive. You want your 7 mana plays to start like winning you the game as soon as you cast them. But the value is big. I think this is a 7. You do have to do a lot of work and put the work into it, but it is definitely a whole lot more powerful than most things you're going to be doing. Of course, I think I also gave the green-blue, when you play it and kick it, it copies a creature you control a 7. So I think this does belong about on the same level as that. Defiler of Vigor is next, and that is 3 green green for a 6/6 with trample. Based on those merits alone, this is already going to be a 7, and I know it does more. As an additional cost to cast green permanent spells, you may pay 2 life. Those spells cost green less to cast if you pay life this way, and it only affects the amount of green mana you pay. And whenever you cast a green permanent spell, put a 1/1 counter on each creature you control. This is pretty close to a 9. I think this might just be a 9. There's going to be games where you have this in your hand and you're like, oh, I'll just wait till I have 7 lands so I can play this in my stupid 2/2 and get a counter on everything for basically free. Or just wait till turn 6 and play like this in a 2-drop. This is so far above par. This is an insane card. Like, you don't even have to have anything else. As it stands, this card just attacks past most board states. God forbid you have like any kind of combat trick or way to make it better. Plus, when you cast a green permanent spell, it goes on each creature you control, not each other one. So if you cast something, this is going to become a 7/7. And it's any green permanent spell. So that includes enchantments, that includes creatures. If you find some kind of way to have a green artifact in this format, congratulations. You have a Defiler of Vigor with an extra counter on it. And it makes them cost less mana if you want to pay life as well. That is a pretty cool, hefty advantage. There's a couple of pretty expensive cards in this format. Like we saw that 7/7 with Trample for 7 that lets you gain some life when it enters the battlefield. You cast this on turn 6 now, and it pays you back the life that you paid for it, and puts a counter on the rest of your creatures. This card is a serious beating, and if it doesn't get answered immediately, it is going to deliver. With that in mind, I'm going to give it an 8. It is not unbeatable, but if it sticks around on the board for more than one turn, it's definitely approaching unbeatable territory. You just need to do work. I think that's the only reason I'm not giving it a 9. You know what? I take that back. This card is a 9. Defiler of Vigor is definitely a 9. Herd Migration is next, and that is 6 and a green for a sorcery. With Domain, create a 3/3 green beast creature token for each basic land type among lands you control. And it also has 1 and a green, discard it, search your library for a basic land card, reveal it, put it into your hand, and shuffle. You gain 3 life. How many tokens does this have to make before you are happy with it? Probably 3. I think 3. If it just makes 2, it's fine. Paying 7 mana for 6/6 worth of power. That is replacement level. But if you're getting 3 of these, it's a pretty good amount of power and toughness. And if you're ever getting 4 or 5, you're just really happy. At that stage of the game, 3/3s I think are still relatively impactful on the board. They combine with like a random 2/2 to kill some of the biggest creatures in the format. This handles almost every other kind of super duper high drop that's in the format, like 7/7 will get blocked if you cast this for 3. And it also just has a second mode that enables you to pitch it to go find a land if you need one. And I think that's really good. It even pays you a little bit of life for your trouble. I think this card is actually a 7. It's first pickable. It's quite powerful. You don't have to do a whole lot of work to make it work. And you're going to be pretty happy when you cast it for 3 or more. Next is Leafcrowned Visionary, which is green for a 1/1. With other elves you control get +1/+1, and whenever you cast an elf spell, you may pay green if you do draw a card. So, in the interest of conserving time, I'll be right back. Okay, so I took a look and there are 3 elves at common. Only one of them I would consider especially playable. It's the blue-green one. And then there's 2 elves at uncommon, and they're both actually pretty good. I don't think this card is a supported archetype. This card's getting a 2. It's a 2 mana 1/1 that has some marginal benefit to a few cards in the format that you're not guaranteed to get any of. The worst ones you're just making slightly better, and the good ones other people are looking for, and you're better off just trying to build a deck based around those cards without worrying about this. Next up is Llanowar Green Widow, which is 2 and a green for a 4/3 with reach and trample, which blows the vanilla test out of the water. Based on those merits alone, this would be close to a 6. And then it also has a pretty sweet ability. 7 at a green, you return it from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. It gains if this permanent will leave the battlefield, exile it instead of putting it anywhere else. And that ability costs 1 less to activate for each basic land type among lands you control. So what does that actually mean in practice? It goes from 8 mana down to a healthy 6 and a 2-color deck that has those colors consistently. If you're doing 3 mana, it goes down to 5. Bottom line, this is a 3 mana 4/3 with Reach and Trample that you can get back at instant speed for some amount of mana later in the game. That's extremely above par. This card is a 7 bordering on an 8 if you ask me. In fact, I think I'll just give it an 8. Because there's no fail case here. The fail case is you play a 3 mana 4/3 with Reach and Trample, and you never get it back. Wow, what a failure, right? The fail case for Herd Migration is you cash it in for a land. That's kind of disappointing, because you're never getting the other benefit. In fact, you can just discard Land of War Queen or Widow if you want to. If for some reason this just ends up getting pitched from your hand to something else, well, congratulations, you get that value later. Herd Migration, you have to find a way to cast it, otherwise you're only going to get a land. This just gives you all the value all the time, and for that reason it's getting an 8 even though Herd Migration got a 7. Land of War Loam Speaker is 1 and a green for a 1/3 that adds 1 mana of any color if you tap it, or makes a land you control a 3/3 elemental creature with haste until end of turn. It's still a land. This is, I think, a 7. I think this is a first pickable card, not only because it is a great mana dork, but also in the late game it turns your excess lands into valuable spells. Valuable creatures, rather. Target land you control becomes a 3/3 elemental creature with haste until end of turn. You do have to use this as a sorcery, so it's not doing a lot of blocking, but I think that's okay. You're going to take what you can get, and 1 and a green 1/3 that tap for any color of mana would be a pretty great pick in this format. So the fact that this one's a rare it tells you something. It tells you that they knew Domain was the set mechanic, and they didn't want you to have to constantly worry about whether or not you were playing green to ensure that you had access to casting your castable spells. I think Land of War Loam Speaker deserves a 7. Pick it first. Build around Domain if you can, otherwise it'll be just fine on its own. Quirion Beastcaller is next. It's 1 and a green for a 2/2, with whenever you cast a creature spell, put a 1/1 counter on it, and when it dies, distribute X 1/1 counters among any number of target creatures you control, where X is the number of 1/1 counters on it. This card's really good. I think it deserves a 6. I think it's pretty far above par, and it also has a pretty interesting death effect, so if you get to play it on turn 2, it's going to be far and away better than almost any other 2-drop in the format, and then if you get a few counters on it, and eventually it'll end up dying to something, well, congratulations, you get to keep the counters. I think that's a really cool ability. I don't think it's necessarily first pickable, because, well, at the end of the day, it is just a beater that, if you draw it in the late game, all it will do is be a 2/2 until you play some more creature spells. But I think that's fine. I think it still deserves a 6. Threats Undetected is 2 and a green for a sorcery that says, search your library for up to 4 creature cards with different powers and reveal them. An opponent chooses 2 of them, shuffle the chosen ones into your library, and put the rest into your hand. What that means in practice is, you search your library for 4 different creature cards with different powers. You get 2 of them. Your opponent is going to choose which 2 you get, and the other 2 go right back in again. This card's amazing. It's like a divination that always draws you creatures, and that is, well, that's pretty good. That's pretty strong. It's never going to draw you removal spells, but getting 2 creatures for the price of 3 mana, guaranteed, and you get some control over what they are, is really powerful. So I'm going to give this I think a 7. I think it's somewhere between a 6 or a 7, but I think it's closer to 7. Urborg Lurgoyf is a real mouthful of a card. It's 1 and a green for a star, 1+star, and it has kicker blue and or black. Pretty complicated magic card right here. Its power is equal to the number of creature cards in your graveyard, and its toughness is equal to that number plus 1. Now, it is only 2 mana, so it's 1 and a green for this thing, and it is at least going to be a 0/1. The kicker abilities are interesting. When it enters the battlefield, mill 3 cards for each time it was kicked. That's a very interesting ability. If you're in black-green, this card is going to be pretty cool. If you're not in black-green, and you're just in like green something, I think it's still going to be fine. It isn't like a lot of other 2-drops in that it's best on turn 2. It's actually better later into the game, especially if you can kick it, when it starts to become like a 4/5 for 2 and stuff like that. In that regard, it is not actually an ideal 2, but I do think it is above par, and for that reason I'll give it a 5. It's never going to be more than just a beater though, and for that reason it won't get a 6. That's it for rares. We're starting to move towards uncommon, so we'll just go to our next color. That is red. Really churning through these cards so far, thank goodness. Jaya, Fiery Negotiator, rip in peace. 2 red for a 4 loyalty planeswalker with 4 abilities as well. +1, you can create a 1/1 red monk creature token with prowess. Those are good. They're not bad. The fact that this protects itself is solid. Even though that's just a 1/1, that's still real. And the fact that it's a +1 is pretty solid. -1. Exile the top 2 cards of your library. Choose one of them, you may play that card this turn. That's actually pretty decent. The fact that it exiles 2 means that you're pretty unlikely to miss, but there are going to be times when you exile 2 good spells and you have to choose. But that's just how these cards work, you know, sometimes stuff just gets exiled. I like it so far. -2, whenever you attack this turn, choose target creature an opponent controls. Jaya deals damage equal to the creature of equal to the number of attacking creatures you control to that creature. Okay. So you choose a creature, attack with a bunch of things, and Jaya deals that much damage to it for 2 loyalty. And then -8 you get an emblem with whenever you cast a red instant or sorcery spell. Copy it twice, you may choose new targets for the copies. Alright, so the bread and butter here is the +1, the -1, and the -2. I don't really think that the -8 is a real consideration, because you don't necessarily always have red instants or sorceries, and they're not always going to be doing exactly what you want besides blowing up your opponent's creatures. I think the first 3 abilities are just fine to consider, and the -8 is just icing on the cake. And how good are those first 3 abilities? Well, they're actually extremely strong. If you're ahead, you're going to -2, kill their best creature, and attack them for a shitload of damage. If you're behind a little bit, creating a 1/1 red monk is going to be alright. And if you're at some kind of board parity, you might be doing the -1 the turn after that, but doing the 1/1 red monk is probably what you're going to be doing turn 1, if you're at any kind of like parity or behind in game. With that in mind, I think this card is definitely a 7 bordering on an 8. It does a lot of stuff. It's definitely not unbeatable, but it's one hell of a powerful card, and the fact that it goes from 4 to 5 loyalty means that I think I'm just gonna actually give it an 8. This card's really strong. Shivan Devastator is next, and it's X and red for a 0/0 with flying and haste, and it enters the battlefield with X 1/1 counters on it. So you play it for 3, you get a 2/2 with flying haste. Play it for 5, you get a 4/4 flying and haste. Play it for 9, you get an 8/8 flying haste. The later in the game you draw it, the better it's going to be, and since it has haste, it's going to beat down pretty quick. Your opponent isn't going to be able to block it if you wait a little while and put enough counters into it. This demands an immediate removal spell, and there are decks that are just not going to be able to beat it. Pre-board, specifically a green-red deck, is going to have an extremely hard time with this. A green-blue deck can like bounce it, I guess. And like green-white has access to a couple of removal spells that will deal with it, but mostly only at sorcery speed or if they have creatures significantly larger than it. So I think this card is... I think it's just a 9. I don't know if it is a 10. I don't know if I would want to give this card a 10. I know I'm going to die to it being cast for like 7 mana. So I think this is as close to a 10 as we've gotten so far. It's definitely a 9 though. Chaotic Transformation is next. It's 5 and a red for a sorcery. Oh god, this is your crazy red rare for the set is this one. Exile up to 1 artifact, up to 1 creature, up to 1 enchantment, and 1 planeswalker, and or 1 land. For each permanent exiled this way, its controller reveals cards from the top of their library until they reveal a card that shares a card type with it, puts that card onto the battlefield, then shuffles. This is just a mess. This is just a big old mess of a card. I don't even want to think about playing it. This is like a 2. I mean, this is like a commander card when you want to like turn your random commander into an Eldrazi or something. But otherwise, it's pretty trash. Don't play this card. It's not good. Defiler of Instinct is 2 red for a 4/4 with first strike, and then it has the same thing that the green Defiler did, except for red. You can pay red less for your red permanent spells if you pay 2 life instead. Whenever you cast a red permanent spell, it deals 1 damage to any target. Wow. Talk about a strict downgrade from the green one. That one gave you a permanent +1/+1 pump to your whole board. This one pings something for 1. It's definitely not weak, but most of the meat you're getting out of this card is actually the cost reduction and the first strike on a 4/4/4. And that's enough to make this card a 7, but definitely not enough to make it an 8, and nowhere near enough to make it a 9. It's first pickable because it passes a vanilla test with flying colors, and making your red permanent spells cheaper is pretty cool. But other than that, it's just mostly a beater. I guess you can ping some stuff for 2 sometimes if you have enough red permanent spells in your hands, but I don't think it's going to happen too very often. Keldon Flamesage is next. It's 2 and a red for a 2/3 with Enlist. And whenever it attacks, look at the top X cards of your library where X is its power. You may exile an instant or sorcery card with mana value X or less. Put the rest on the bottom in a random order. You may cast the exiled card without paying its mana cost. I like this card a lot. It has an opportunity cost, but it has a good amount of toughness, and when it attacks, you kind of get some interesting free value. Obviously, you want to be dumping as much power as you can into this, but red has access to some sweet removal spells, and if you're playing like red-black specifically, or even like red-blue, this is going to be a really strong card, because you're going to get like a free combat trick or a free removal spell off of it, and that's quite strong. So I think I'm starting this at 6, because the fail case is just a 2/3 for 3 mana, and there's plenty of those in the set already that are at least at replacement level. It's not like it's a 1/1 for 3 or something, so it at least does attack and block as a 2/3 with the chance for value, and if you're ever in a position where you're attacking for more, this can just get out of hand pretty quickly. It's definitely not a 7, however. You need to have the deck already kind of partially assembled, and I could definitely see myself taking several uncommons over this. Rada's Firebrand is next, 1 and a red for a 3/1. Whenever it attacks, a target creature defending player controls with power less than its power can't block this turn. And you can pay 5 and a red to give it +2/+2 until end of turn, only once each turn, and it costs 1 less to activate for each basic land type among lands you control. So 6 mana. If you have 2 colors, it goes down to 4 mana. Yeah, I like this card. I like this card a good amount. So it's 3/1 for 2, and it has a Threat of Activation ability on it that you can also use at sorcery speed on your turn or before attacks to make sure something big can't block. So I like this card a lot. It's good on defense because it turns out that actually 3/1s for 2 are actually pretty solid on defense because they can block things with 3 toughness pretty well. And there's a surprising number of 4 mana 3/3s in the set at uncommon. So I think I'm going to give this card a 6. It's not necessarily something I'm looking to first pick, but it's definitely stronger than most cards. Rundvelt Horde Master is a 1 and a red 1/1 with other goblins you control get +1/+1. Whenever it or another goblin dies, exile the top card of your library. If it's a goblin, you may cast it till the end of your next turn. This is a 2, it is an unsupported archetype. Squee Dubious Monarch is 2 and a red for a 2/2 with haste, and whenever it attacks, you create a 1/1 red goblin creature token. It's tapped and attacking. You may cast Squee from your graveyard by paying 3 and a red, and exiling 4 other cards from your graveyard rather than paying its mana cost. Okay, so it has an escape cost, basically. Okay. Interesting. It's 3 and a red for its escape and exile 4 cards. I like this card. I think this card's cool. There's going to be some problems if you're trying too desperately to get your 3 mana 2/2 to attack into their board state sometimes. But the fact that it's giving you 2 expendable creatures every time you attack with it is going to be quite good for red-white and for red-black. It's a little bit less good, I think, in red-green, unless you're like overloaded on combat tricks and ways to make it better. Overall, I would give this a 6. I think it is above replacement level, and I think it is stronger than a good number of cards in the set. But you need to do a lot of work to make this like busted. I think the strength of it is that it's a 3 mana 2/2 that you can cast later on in the game for a pretty low cost, pretty marginal, especially if you're in any kind of color combo that doesn't worry about your graveyard too much, or if you're like exiling spells or something. So I'm pretty happy with Squee at 6. Temporal Firestorm is 3 red-red with some pretty wild kicker costs of 1 in a white and or 1 in a blue. Temporal Firestorm deals 5 damage to each creature and each planeswalker. And for the kicker, choose up to X creatures and or planeswalkers you control, where X is the number of times a spell was kicked. Those permanents phase out. Interesting. So, you get a board wipe. Pretty good one. 5 damage is a lot. Most things are going to be dying to that. And if you pay the kicker cost, which is pretty reasonable, you get to save something, or maybe even 2 things if you have the mana. I like this. It's a relatively cheap catch-up mechanic that has a built-in bonus if you have one of those 2 colors available, or both. I think I'm going to give that a 7. I think it is pretty handy to have that kind of ace up your sleeve, and you can definitely build around it, and it's definitely strong enough to earn you a 3 or 4 for 1 in a lot of games. It's not insurmountable, and obviously if you're playing limited you do need to have creatures on the battlefield to win the game, but it's definitely strong. The Elder Dragon War is 2 red-red for a saga with read ahead, which means you could start at chapter 2 or 3 and do those immediately but skip 1 or 2. Chapter 1, the Elder Dragon War, deals 2 damage to each creature and each opponent. Interesting. Chapter 2, discard any number of cards, then draw that many cards. Chapter 3, create a 4/4 dragon creature token with flying. This is an interesting card. I think you can build around this pretty reliably by trying to do some aggressive trades and even some suicidal attacks, like throwing your 2/2 directly at their face and stuff, and they like block with a 4/4 or something, and you could just play out your Elder Dragon War. Additionally, you have the fail case of just playing this out on turn 4 and getting a 4/4 dragon creature token with flying. You kind of get to have your cake and eat it too. Do whatever on this card you want to do, pretty much the turn you play it. You don't even have to do the first 2 chapters if they're not especially beneficial for you, or you don't have any cards you want to discard, or you have some 2 toughness creatures you don't want to blow up. You could just have a 4/4 creature token with flying, and that's going to be enough in some games, because 4/4 flyer for 4 is way, way, way above rate, and the card only gets potentially better from there. So I think this is close to a 9. I'm going to give it a 9. Then we go into the uncommons, but we've already done those in a previous video. So we're going to move on to black. Only 2 colors left after this one. Liliana of the Veil is 1 black for a 3 loyalty planeswalker with +1 each player discards a card, -2 target player sacrifices a creature, and -6 separate all permanents target players controls into 2 piles. That player sacrifices all permanents in the pile of their choice. This card is a beating. Generally what's going to happen is if you can find a way to play it on turn 3, you're going to make your opponent sacrifice a creature. They might not have anything else in play after that. If they don't, well, good news. Now you get to Lily for the rest of the game, probably. You can do a lot with this card. This card's very strong. In fact, there's a decent chance that the best line of play you're going to do with this card is immediately -2, and if it survives, you +1, and then just immediately -2 again. You're getting 2 creatures out of that, and then the discard effect is symmetrical. So this card can pretty easily become a 2-for-1. The problem occurs when your opponent has flying creatures, and all you're getting is the sacrifice 1. Even so, I think this card is at least a 7, because the potential there is pretty sizable, and if you're playing black, you have ways to make use of the discard, like pitching some creatures that you can get back, stuff like that. So I think this is at least a 7, and that's the grade I'm comfortable giving it at first. Shoulder the Apocalypse is next, and it's 2 black for a 4/5 with Death Touch, and whenever you draw a card you gain 2 life, and whenever an opponent draws a card, they lose 2 life. This card is insane. This is a if you ask me, an 8, because it is at the end of the day just a creature. It might be closer to a 9 than an 8 though, because if you're playing like green anything, this card is impossible to win against. Like, they're going to be gaining life. You can't trade with this very well with a fight spell. It's really hard to get a bite to kill a 5 toughness creature in a lot of board state situations. You can't really attack into it very well either. It trades for literally anything. It attacks extremely well. God forbid you try to double block it, you just get 2-for-1. And in the meantime, it sits on the board and just does what it does, which is gain you life and lose the opponent life. It's a very, very strong card. I think I'm comfortable starting it at 8, and maybe my valuation will go up, but you should definitely be first picking this card, and I don't think there are any uncommons in the set that even come remotely close. Parade's Arisen Nightmare is 1 black for a 3/3 with, at the beginning of your end step, you may sacrifice an artifact, creature, enchantment, land, or planeswalker. If you do, each opponent may sacrifice a permanent that shares a card type. For each opponent who doesn't, that player loses 2 life and you draw a card. So, this card is good, but you do need some dispensable stuff. In specifically red-black, this card's going to be busted because there's a lot of ways that sacrificing things is beneficial to you, and there's a pretty good number of disposable creatures in pretty much every black color combination, especially black-red and black-white. You also have a active treason effect in black-red that this would be obviously pretty good with, but I digress. I think I'm comfortable starting this card at 7. It's solid, lets you trade 1 resource for another, and in black specifically, those resources are pretty easy to recur, so this breaks the symmetry pretty quick, and in the late game, you're just going to be sacking lands to get good value. Your opponent can't just take 2 forever, and if they start sacrificing things too, generally you're going to be okay with that. Defiler of Flesh is our next card. 2 black black for a 4/4 with Menace. It has the same Defiler text as the others, except for black mana. You can pay 2 life instead of 1 black pip and all your black permanent spells. And whenever you cast a permanent black spell, target creature you control gains +1/+1 and gains Menace until end of turn. So it's interesting that they went with +1/+1 and Menace instead of some kind of like -1/-1 or something like that, which seems a bit more organic for black, especially for like Phyrexian black cards. But you know, that's their call. On its own merits, just as a card, I think this is strong. 4/4 for 4 with Menace is pretty good. I would give that card a 5 on its own, and then the additional cost reduction and bonuses you get, I think bring this up to like a 5.5, 6. It's definitely the worst one of these we've seen so far, because I think Menace is a pretty good amount worse than First Strike as far as attacking abilities, and I think that the green one is obviously just busted to hell and back. So I'm comfortable with 6 for Defiler of Flesh. No, 5? 5.5? Yeah, 5.5. Drag to the bottom is 2 black black for a sorcery. Domain, each creature gets -X/-X until end of turn, where X is 1 plus the number of basic land types among lands you control. So bare minimum, probably getting -3/-3 out of this. That's pretty powerful. That's going to wipe away a lot of 4 drops and lower. And if you can ever get this to work for X equals 4, then you're just really doing a good job. It's a very, very cheap sweeper. It's pretty easy to find a scenario where this is in your opener, and you kind of sandbag some of your creatures so your opponent overcommits. Pretty easily get like a 2-for-1 or a 3-for-1 out of this. And with that in mind, I think it easily can be a 7. And a lot of games it's going to play like an 8. Evolved Sleeper's next. A single black mana for a 1/1 that has 3 activated abilities. I like these sorts of cards, they're always interesting. You can pay black mana, it becomes a human cleric with base power and toughness 2/2. Then you can pay 1 and a black. If it's a cleric, put a death touch counter on it and it becomes a Phyrexian human cleric with base power and toughness 3/3. And then for 1 black black, if it is a Phyrexian, which means you have to use the first and the second ability to make it happen first, put a 1/1 counter on it, then you draw a card and you lose 1 life. So this card is strong. If you pump 4 mana into it, it is a death touch 3/3. But you get to do that in installment plans, and it has no like timing restrictions. So you can hold up mana, do this if your opponent doesn't do anything, do it in response to blocks, do it in response to a fight, pretty much anything. I think this card is a 7. It's going to be something that is going to request removal relatively quickly. Otherwise, your opponent's just going to turn it into a 3/3 and then start throwing counters on it to gain life and, to draw cards and put counters on it. And at only 3 mana, relatively quickly into the game, your opponent's going to start doing this 2 times a turn. And that's going to be brutal if they actually have the 4 black mana to do it. So I'm comfortable with a 6.5, bordering on 7. I think I actually might be comfortable first picking this, so I'm going to give it a 7. Now we have Shadowrite Priest, which is 1 and a black for a human cleric, 2/2, with other clerics you control get +1/+1, and sacrifice another cleric, search your library for a black creature card, put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle. I don't remember how many clerics there are, so I'll be right back. Okay, so I'm back, and there's not really that many, and most of them are 2-drops. So this is a little mini lord for your 2s that goes and gets you some interesting stuff, I guess, and maybe some legends, but I don't think it's that interesting. I think if you have several of those clerics. This moves up from a 4 to like a 4.5, but it's pretty replacement level if you ask me. Most of those clerics don't have absurd enter the battlefield abilities unless they were kicked, or you got some of the uncommon legends, and you need to be specifically in black-white to make actual use of this card, so I'm going to give it a 5. Stronghold Arena is next, 1 in black for an enchantment. Whenever one or more creatures you control deals combat damage to a player, you may reveal the top card of your library. If you do, put it into your hand. If you do, you lose life equal to its mana value. And you can kick it for green and or white, and if you do, you gain 3 life for each time it was kicked. This is an interesting card. You're going to know when you want this if you have some aggressive flying creatures, or you're the beatdown deck and you just want to draw some cards. This is going to be a card you're kind of happy to get. It's only ever going to trigger once per turn, but if you can draw 2 cards off this, you've done your job. I think this is a 6. I definitely don't think it's a 7. I'm definitely not looking to first pick this card. I would take like a lot of strong uncommons over it. But it's not bad. It's not a bad card. It's just pretty far from amazing. Cruelty of Gix is next. Read ahead. 3 black enchantment. Let's see what these chapters do. Chapter 1. Target opponent reveals their hand. You choose a creature or planeswalker card from it. That player discards that card. Okay. From what we know in this limited format, there are going to be more often than usual creature cards inside your opponent's hand that have been sitting there for a little while, because people are looking to get that value from the kicker costs. With that in mind, Chapter 1 does feel better. Chapter 2 is search your library for a card, put it into your hand, then shuffle. You lose 3 life. This is not always going to be something you can even afford to do, so it's nice that you have read ahead, so you can decide if you even want it. And then Chapter 3, put a creature card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control. I like this card a lot. It does a lot of things. I think altogether, this card is probably an 8, because it just does so much. It's basically a 3-for-1 if you do it all. That costs some time and some life. But if your opponent plays this on turn 5, you're almost certainly going to get something stripped from your hand. They're going to have enough life to go get something from their deck, which will more often than not be a removal spell for your best creature, which they will then get to cast because it didn't cost them any mana that turn to do it. And then the turn after that, they're going to take your best creature that they just killed with their removal spell and get it for free. So this card is a hefty beating. And one thing I didn't even think about is, like, imagine your opponent has this as well as a Wrath. This would be a 10. Like, it is a Thoughtseize effect that also is a Resurrection effect, and also goes and gets them a Wrath, so they can choose from all of your best creatures that you had in play, and theirs. This card is, I think, a 9, actually. The more I think about it, the more I think that the lines of play involving this card are just absolutely miserable to play against, and you have to really be pressuring your opponent for this card to not just completely overwhelm you. Next up, and our last card in black, is the Raven Man, which is 1 and a black for a 2-1, with, at the beginning of each end step, if a player discarded a card this turn, create a 1/1 blackbird creature token with flying, and this creature can't block. So, this does randomly hose a couple of cards, specifically in red, and I guess, I think there's 1 or 2 in black and blue as well. But most of the time, it's going to be a 2-1 that you can throw 4 mana into to make your opponent discard a card. There's no guarantee that the card they discard is going to be that good. And I'll be honest, a 1/1 blackbird creature token that can't even block is a little bit lackluster. I think this card is above par, since it is a serviceable 2 that later on in the game you can get some extra value out of if you have some mana laying around. But I don't think that brings it higher than a 5. I think it is just a serviceable 2. I don't think it's an especially great one. Actually, you know what? I'm being kind of foolish. Maybe I'm just expecting more than this card should be giving. I'll give this a 6. I think it is a 6. That ability is actually a way that your 2 is serviceable later in the game, and when that's the case, I think 6s kind of belong there. I passed it up. Here we are in blue, starting with the Mythics and working our way down to the rares. We have Sphinx of Clear Skies, which is 3 blue, or a 5/5 flying with Ward 2. Alright, so if that was just in the set as is, it would be a 7. 5/5 flyer for 5 with Ward 2 would be a first pickable card. Definitely better than almost every common and uncommon in the set. Definitely better than most removal spells. Doesn't even die to some of the removal spells in the set, which makes it definitely far and away the best card in a lot of packs. But there's even more. So we got a lot of stuff going on here. When it deals combat damage to a player, reveal the top X cards of your library, where X is the number of basic land types among lands you control. So, bare minimum, the worst possible you're going to get in most situations is 2. So separate that many cards into 2 piles. An opponent separates them into 2 piles. You put one into your hand and the other into your graveyard, and piles can in fact be empty. So it is a 7 that when it hits your opponent, you draw at least 1 card. This is bordering on a 9. Your opponent has to kill this, and if they do not immediately untap and kill it, you get immediate value off of it. If you ever have to sit back on blocks with this, it's also just extremely large and difficult to get through. So I think this is a 9. It might be like 9.2 or so. I don't think it's a 10 because it's definitely not unbeatable. It's not like a Dream Trawler, that's for goddamn sure, thank God. But it is extremely strong, and you're going to be first picking this card if it's in the pack over every single other card in the set. Even if, I think I would take this over the green Defiler, to be honest. Because the green Defiler doesn't have any kind of inherent protection, and it needs to fully survive a turn and come back, and you have other things in your hand to do with it. This is better than that. This doesn't require anything except 5 mana. It is a self-contained draw engine with a protection ability. Vesuvian Diplomacy is next. 3 into blue for an enchantment that says whenever you cast a spell that targets only a single artifact or creature you control, create a token that's a copy of that artifact or creature, except it's not legendary. So, it has to be spells, and they have to target a single artifact or creature you control, which means we're talking about like pump spells and like auras, enchantments specifically. I don't think this is that good of a card. This seems like a constructed card. I don't want to be playing bad cards in my deck to make this card better, because then what happens is I need creatures in play, I need this card in play, and then I also need combat tricks. And my reward for finding a way to cast the combat trick is I do get cool stuff, but that is a lot of stuff and it's not going to work out a lot of the time. And it also has to be a single. So it can't be like I pump up my 2 creatures because there's at least one white combat trick that affects 2 things. And there's a lot of stuff that just does not work with this. I think it's a little bit too much work. If you can get there and you're like playing a bunch of combat tricks, you could copy some stuff and win a game off this, nice. But it is worth noting that the first time you get a trigger off this, you're not actually getting anything except the card you played back. You're not getting any extra value. you're just making this card the bare minimum of playable. You have turned this card into the thing you copied. So if you're copying a 3/2 or something, well, congratulations. You paid 4 mana and spent a good amount of game planning and thinking to create that 3/2. In addition to actually casting a combat trick. I think this is a 5 at the best of times. And I'm not looking to first pick it at all or play it most of the time. Academy Lore Master is blue for a 2/3 with at the beginning of each player's draw step, that player may draw an additional card. If they do, spells they cast cost an additional 2 to cast. Interesting. That turn, anyway. So this is really good with instants, and it's really good in the late game if you have a lot of lands in play, because you don't really care about the cost increase for your spells. However, your opponent also gets it. The thing that breaks the parity here is that they get the card first, and that is a little bit bad because they can just untap and draw the card and then use a slightly more expensive removal spell to kill it. And I think that's going to be the case enough times to where I'm not too happy with Academy Lore Master. I think with that in mind, I'll give it like a 4.5. I think it's above replacement level, but there are definitely fail cases that are really bad for you. Either Channeler's next, and that is 2 and a blue for a 2/1 with 1 of 3 enter the battlefield abilities that you get to choose from. Create a 1/1 white bird flying creature token with flying. Return another target non-land permanent to its owner's hand and draw a card. The one that you're probably going to be using the most is draw a card or create a 1/1 flyer. Probably draw a card, and that ability is quite strong, but I don't know if this card is a 7. I think this card is a 6. It's above par, and above a lot of commons, but it's definitely far from like a busted card. It's just a good one. I would compare this to like a Phyrexian Rager, to be honest, because Phyrexian Rager is only slightly less good than this, because it does just draw you a card, and it does not take up a rare slot. Defiler of Dreams is next. 3 blue for a 4/3 with flying. That's actually a pretty good amount above par for the set. We would give that a 6 probably, but we have more. As an additional cost, you do get the Defiler effect, but in blue, and then whenever you cast a blue permanent spell, draw a card. Draw a card is a pretty fantastic bonus. We've seen like the full range of abilities with these Defilers. We have Pump Your Whole Team, Ping something for 1, give a creature +1/+1 and menace until end of turn, and now we have draw a whole ass card. It's a pretty interesting list of abilities. But what kind of grade does this card get? I think it's definitely something you're going to first pick for sure. Is it an 8 though? Let's consult our guide and take a look real quick. 8 is God tier, cards that make your opponent sigh. Extremely strong or hyper efficient. Yeah, I think this definitely qualifies as an 8. Defiler of Dreams, good job. Next up is Haughty Djinn. Or, yeah, I guess you could consider it a Haughty Djinn, really. 1 blue for a star 4 with flying, and its power is equal to the number of instant and sorcery cards in your graveyard. But let's be honest, this is a star 4 flyer for 3 mana. You would be happy if this was a 2/4, and there's going to be a lot of times when it's a good amount higher than that. And even as a 1/4, it's not like bad, it's just okay. It's actually not too bad at all, and it's going to be a lot more than a 1/4 most of the time. So it also has instant and sorcery spells you cast cost 1 less to cast, which is a pretty hefty discount, and it didn't even need that. Like that's just a tack-on ability, but it's quite strong. That makes it to where you're going to be able to cast like a spell as well as another spell a good amount of the time if you're consistently like drawing cards. the divination becomes 2 mana. The bounce spell that draws you a card becomes 2 mana. This is a very strong card, and I think that this is a 7. The reason that it's a 7 and not an 8 is because while it is first pickable and it's a great flying beater that has cool text on it, it has no protection. Your opponent is just going to blow it up some amount of the time. It does just die to removal, it doesn't have any kind of extra things attached to it, and it doesn't draw you cards. So 7, definitely first pickable. Silver Scrutiny is blue X for a sorcery that says you may cast it as though it had flash if X is 3 or less, draw X cards. I like this card. You could play it as a 4 mana draw 2 or a 5 mana draw 3 if you want to cast it at instant speed. Otherwise, it is going to be a card you're going to draw in the late game, and you're going to cash it in for like 5, and your opponent's going to go, ugh. And because of that, I think this card's an 8. Definitely 100% first pick it. There's going to be times where you're like, I'm a little under the gun, I didn't do anything this turn, my hand's looking a little slow, so I'm going to cash this in for 2 or 3 cards. And you know what? That's perfectly valid. That's 100% okay. The fact that you get the fail case of drawing two cards or 3 cards, or sometimes even 1 if you really need to, is good. And then in the late game, surprise, you could draw like 5 or 6 cards, and it's just stupid, busted, insane. So that is kind of a textbook 8. It's not busted, insane in like the unbeatable sense, but it's far, far above par, and when you play it, your opponent's going to go, ugh. And that's what an 8 is. The phasing of Zhalfir is 2 blue for a enchantment saga with read ahead, and the first 2 chapters read the same. They say, another target non-land permanent phases out. It can't phase in for as long as you control this permanent. And then the third one says, destroy all creatures. For each creature destroyed this way, its controller creates a 2/2 black Phyrexian creature token. So, creatures as they are in Limited, demoting all of your opponent's creatures to black 2/2 Phyrexian creature tokens is actually not that good. You do get to save your creatures, but realistically, all you're doing is placing all the creatures on an even level and making it to where post board wipe you can play something that's big enough to block 2/2s pretty profitably. For that reason, I think it isn't going to be a 7. I think it's more of a 6. There are scenarios that you have to work towards in order to make this card pretty busted. But I think it was just a cool design they made. I don't think this is like an amazing, powerful control finisher or anything like that. It's just good. Vodalian Hexcatcher is next. That's 1 and a blue for a flash 1/1 Merfolk with other Merfolk you control get +1/+1. And then you can sacrifice a Merfolk to counter target non-creature spell unless its controller pays 1. This is an unsupported archetype, this is a constructed seed, and this is a 2 out of 10. Vodalian Mindsinger is next, and it's 1 blue for a 2/2. That when it enters the battlefield, gain control of target creature with power less than its power for as long as you control it. It also has Kicker for 1 and a red, and or 1 and a green, and for each time it was kicked, it gets 2 +1/+1 counters. And let me tell you, if you ever kick this, this card is going to be fantastic. I think this is definitely first pickable, but I do not think that it's grown worthy. Specifically because if you destroy this, you do get your creature back, and at the end of the day, it is just a thing. Like, the most counters you're ever going to get out of this is by paying 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 mana to get a 6/6. And while a 6/6 is pretty cool and big, that is spread across 3 different colors. I think this card is a 7. Well, you know, nah, this card's an 8. I think 8 is worth. I think that's a good valuation. We'll go with 8. And with that, we're finally into white, our last color before we head over to lands. Sarah Paragon is a 2 white 3/4 flyer that says once during each of your turns, you may play a land from your graveyard or cast a permanent spell with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard. If you do, it gains when this permanent is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, exile it, and you gain 2 life. Well, this card is pretty obviously busted. I think it's a 9. Doesn't require a lot from you, other than to do things unlimited that you're already doing. I think this card is a 9 out of 10. I don't think it approaches 10 because you do have to have at least some number of things in your graveyard, and you do have to actually have it survive in order to use it. But there's going to be plenty of situations for you to do that, and it's definitely stronger than almost anything else in the limited format. Next we have Anointed Peacekeeper for 2 and a white, which is a 3/3 with Vigilance, and it has an interesting enter the battlefield ability. Look at your opponent's hand, then choose any card name. Spells your opponent's cast with the chosen name cost 2 more to cast, and activated abilities of sources with the chosen name cost 2 more to activate, unless they're mana abilities. So, it is hand interaction on a passing vanilla test card. And also it is just interaction with a card that is on board if you want it to be, if it has activated abilities. There aren't that many things with activated abilities that you need to be terribly worried about, but there are some things, and I think generally speaking this card does enough on its face to be valuable in the early game and the late game. With that in mind, I think it deserves a 6. I'm not really eager to first pick this card because I think it's only just okay, but it is pretty strong. Archangel of Wrath is next, and it's a 2 white for a 3/4 flying lifelink angel with kicker for black and or red. When it enters the battlefield, if it was kicked once, it deals 2 to something. If it was kicked twice, it deals 2 to something, and then 2 to something as well. So, if you kick it twice, you get 2 pings for 2 to any target. Kick it once, you get 1 ping for 2 to any target. If you can activate the kicker ability twice, this card is going to play like a 9, almost 10. If you are just able to do it once, it's definitely going to play like a 9 still. If you can't activate the abilities, it's going to play like a 7. I think that's pretty clear. Yeah. Danitha, Benalia's Hope, is 4 and a white for a 4/4 with First Strike, Vigilance, and Lifelink. So, I don't generally love 5 mana 4/4s, but I gotta tell ya, I really like this one. First Strike, Vigilance, and Lifelink are 3 abilities that are extremely strong and work together extremely well. Your opponent has to do some serious work to blast past this thing, and if you have any kind of way to modify it or make it stronger, it's going to be really difficult to get through it for your opponent. And when it enters the battlefield, you may put an aura or equipment card from your hand or graveyard onto the battlefield attached to her. Not a lot of those. There's some equipments, but getting them into the graveyard is kind of eh. I guess if you're playing green-white and you pick this up, this is a pretty good reason to play one of the equipments. There's an okay one at common, and an okay one at uncommon as well. The one at uncommon with this card is absolutely bananas, but I think a lot of decks are just not going to be playing those equipments, so you have a good chance of picking one up if you get Danitha. I would pick up Danitha as an 8 out of 10, because it is way above par and difficult to deal with unless your opponent just removes it immediately. And if you can reliably get the equipment to just jump into play on it, and it survives for any amount of time, it's going to play like a 9, because it will single-handedly command the board state and demand really good answers from your opponent. Defiler of Faith is next, and that is 3 white for a 5/5 with Vigilance. It has the Defiler text, which means you can pay 2 life instead of white for 1 white mana for your white permanent spells, and whenever you cast a white permanent spell, you get a 1/1 white soldier creature token. Well, this is a fine tack-on ability. I like it. The main meat of this card is, of course, the 5/5 for 5 with Vigilance, and I think that is quite strong. We would probably give that a 6, because we expect when we pay 5 mana, we're getting a 4/4. And that's like replacement level to 5 or so, depending on the format. And then the other stuff on top of this pushes it up to a 7 in my estimation. Now we have Guardian of Nubenalia, which is 1 and a white for a 2/2 with Enlist. And when it enlists a creature, scry 2, and you can discard a card to give it indestructible until end of turn and tap it. This card is quite strong. What's going to happen is you get to attack with this, enlist a creature, scry 2. If your opponent blocks with anything at all, even if it's just 2 tokens, you can discard the worst card in your hand to give this indestructible. And your opponent just can't do that ad nauseam, because every turn you're gonna be able to do this if you have like any kind of good board state. And if you have a big creature, give this like somewhere between like 6 and 8 power total. Your opponent's gonna start running out of things, and in the late game you can start pitching lands to it. And if you're playing black-white specifically, you can start pitching creatures for you to get back with your reanimation, or rather your raised dead effects. There's a lot of stuff you can do with this. And it's also just a 2/2 for 2 that you can play on turn 2. That does cool stuff. So it is both good in the early game and good in the late game. For that reason, I think it's a 7. Alright, we have only 4 things left. Leyline Binding is 5 into white for a enchantment with flash, and it costs 1 less for each basic land type among lands you control. When it enters the battlefield, exile target non-land permanent an opponent controls until it leaves the battlefield. So if you have the full 5, it costs only 1 mana. More often than not, you're going to have somewhere between 2 and 4. If you have 3, this is going to be 3, and it has flash. Pretty easy to get a 2-for-1 out of this off of a double block, or just to deal with your opponent's best threat. However, I think that puts it in the category of 6 for good removal. I don't think that makes it a 7. I don't really want to first pick this card. Next is Temporary Lockdown, which is an enchantment for 1 white, and it says when it enters the battlefield, exile each non-land permanent with mana value 2 or less until it leaves the battlefield. It is kind of funny that this card is called Temporary Lockdown. I know that they do their designs like way ahead of time, like by years, but I have to imagine that there's the irony of having this card released in this day and age, with things as they are, is it's not lost on the people at Wizards, I would hope. But I think this card is not very good. I think it's okay. You can get some 2-for-1s with it, but I don't expect them to be too common or too good. I think this is alright. This is like a 6. I don't really think this is a 7. I don't want to first pick this card. Then I have to start worrying about what I'm playing into it, whether or not my opponent has an additional 2-drop. Yeah, it's just a lot to think about and work with. Urza Assembles the Titans is 3 white for an enchantment saga with read ahead. Chapter 1 is scry 4, then look at the top card of your library. If a planeswalker card is revealed this way, put it into your hand. Okay, so in limited, that's just not a thing. Oh, okay, so this whole thing's a Planeswalker card. You can read the rest on the screen, pause the video if you want to. This card's not good, this is 2, it's an unsupported archetype. Not playing it ever. Valiant Veteran is 1 and a white for a 2/2. With other soldiers you control get +1/+1, and you can exile it from your graveyard from 3 4 3 white 3 white to put a 1/1 counter on each soldier you control. There's a couple of soldiers in the set, not a whole lot of them, but one thing to note is that I think a good number of those soldier tokens, yeah, the soldier creature tokens are actually soldiers. So this is a solid in the early game 2/2 that also is a lord for your other soldiers, and in the late game you can get rid of it from your graveyard to give a permanent benefit to all the ones you have on the battlefield. And I think that makes this a I think this makes this a 7, because you could first pick it and then try to build around it. Alright, with that in mind, we're going to go over to our land slots at the rare and mythic level. We have the pain lands. So the pain lands are good for fixing, and I would take them at like a 6 for my deck if I'm in those colors. Otherwise, I don't really like them a lot in this set, specifically because they do not have the basic land types, and those are crucial for domain. Then there's Plaza of Heroes, which is really annoying. So it asks you to play a lot of legends, and you can do that. There's a lot of legends at uncommon, but a lot of them are kind of archetype dependent. Like, you can't really play a deck where the red-black 3-drop legend that makes 2/1s and like the blue-green legend that makes 3/3 lands are really synergizing especially well. And if you don't draw Plaza of Heroes specifically, you just have those 2 cards sitting in your deck being completely uncastable until like turn 5 together, basically. This card is a constructed seed. It's not a limited card, it's an unsupported archetype, and it's a 2. You're going to see this land get passed around pretty often. Don't pick it up, it'll just make your deck worse, in my opinion. Then we have Thran Portal. And it's a good looking land. I don't know exactly how to evaluate the cost of 1 life every time you tap it, because that is definitely a very real cost. But I do think that you pick it up as a 6. I don't think I want to first pick this card. I think in general, a lot of the tap lands are going to be better than this. I think the tap lands are closer to 7, even though I think I also gave those 6s. So this might be closer to a 5 than a 6. And then that's it. That's all the lands we've got. So what do we think about this set? As far as colors? Well, the full breakdown of that's going to be in a different video. That's also going to be in my set review playlist. But overall, I really like the set. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff going on. I think the rares are, for the most part, pretty well balanced. There weren't any 10s. There weren't any things that are just completely unbeatable, that win the game the turn that you cast them, and are impossible to get out from underneath. I think the closest thing was the Flying Ward Sphinx that draws cards when it attacks and hits people, because that thing is obviously insane. But that's it. Like, everything else is super beatable. Either things that are like clear 2-for-1s or more, but that you can either play around or just remove and take your medicine. There are a lot of groan-worthy things, or things that are obviously better than everything else at the common and uncommon slots. But I think that's okay in a limited format to be at uncommon, or not uncommon, to be at rare and mythic. Overall, I hope you've enjoyed the set review. Thank you for tuning in. You've been watching Robot Rallis. Please have yourself a wonderful night, and please consider subscribing, liking, and commenting on this video. Until next time.